All right, if you've been in shul yesterday, you know that and followed the laning, the Parsha of Shoftim has so many different things, so many different topics, so many different laws, and we have to pick something. And just a comment about two others that deserve talking about, but we're not going to, is the all the laws of judges. And what's kind of remarkable is that this is 3,000 years ago. There's detailed laws of how judges should conduct themselves so that they affect justice, how to deal with the different litigants, how not to um, uh, take um, prejudice an outcome because of status or because of importance, and certainly not take bribes and not be influenced. And all of these principles are principles of all Western democratic societies. And they are not principles that you find throughout history of kingdoms, where there are kings, and I mean that's the way the world was. Everybody had kingdoms. All countries had kings until the revolution, which is relatively modern in history. And the Torah also says, when it talks about a king, it has this remarkable half phrase that a king is not to hold himself higher than the subjects. Now, that's like an impossible statement for the history of kings of nations. Kings were always well above the law. They were the law. They were well above all of their subjects. Many were simply dictators, not too many benevolent kings, although there were some. But all kings held themselves as superior to their subjects. And here the Torah makes the statement, in a Jewish kingdom, in the Jewish future, that kings are not any more superior to all of their subjects. Both the king and all subjects are subject to the Torah. And the king has to carry around a copy of the Torah with him all the time to remind him that he is responsible as everybody else, and he has no more privileges. Now, when the halacha talks about this, the oral law, the king does have certain tasks which give him responsibilities like setting up an army and to handle the economy and to assure peace from the neighboring countries. And so there are differences in the tasks of a king, but he is not to see himself as innately superior to anybody else, which is just a remarkable statement. Anyway, we're not going to talk about any of that. What we're going to talk about is something in the end of the parsha that focuses on Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's method of interpreting the Torah text, because that's what we've done throughout all of our shiurim, is to focus on the way he approaches the interpretation of text. And this is just a very good example of how to understand a paragraph which ordinarily is, you read it and you hear it, but you couldn't explain it. Couldn't explain all the details of what the ritual is about and what the point is about and what the values behind it and so forth. So that's what we're going to focus on. So as a sort of an introduction, I'm going to remind you, because I've mentioned this before, especially in Shemot when we talked about Parshas Mishpatim, the Hirsch's approach to the different categories of mitzvot that we find in the Torah. The two major categories are Mishpatim and Chukim. And if you remember, Mishpatim are laws, but they're social laws that need no symbolic analysis to understand them. In other words, there are laws which most societies have in some form or other. The Torah's hit on the particular social laws are very often different from the other societies, but not different in concept, but different in application. Where some of the other social laws in the societies are not necessarily just laws or laws that are equal rights for everybody. But the point is that these kinds of social laws are laws which are understandable. For example, when there's a law about lending a Jew money at no interest, that's a mishpat. In other words, we can understand the rationale behind it, that there's nothing wrong with lending somebody money at interest because you're losing money. And if you're giving them the money that you could use for yourself in investment or buying stock for your store or whatever, then there's no the person is renting your money and you're taking rent for the money lent, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the Torah itself says that you can lend money at interest for a non-Jew because there's nothing inherently unjust or it's not a moral issue to lend money and take interest as sort of a rental on the money. But the Torah says uniquely, if we're talking about a fellow Jew, then a fellow Jew is part of your family. It's like lending money to your own family, and therefore you don't take interest, you don't take rent, as it were, from a fellow Jew, even if it involves you losing a little bit of money. Um, if somebody needs help, lend them and don't make them pay interest. Now, again, that's a whole story because later on in history, this was modified as well. But in any case, it's an idea. The point is, it's a social law that we can understand, or not to exploit the vulnerable in society. Okay, that we don't have to explain what the value is, what the ethical principle is about not exploiting vulnerable people in a society. So those are called mishpatim, and we don't need a decoding of rituals that we do for other things. But here are some of the examples where we do need it, according to Rav Hirsch. Other mitzvot, that word should be chukim. I don't know why it doesn't show. Um, they're called chukim, or ritual laws, or signs, otot. An ot is also a symbol, and it means that the mitzvah has a symbolic meaning to it. So whether it's a chok or an ot, uh, they represent fundamental ideas but are preserved in the behavior, in the ritual behavior, even when we don't understand the reason at the moment. In other words, we have to, according to Hirsch, we have to really strive to decode the meaning. But while we're trying to figure out the meaning for these hukim or otot, we still have to do the behavior. So tefillin are called an ot, it's a symbol. Tzitzit are obviously symbolic because it says look at it and it should evoke the ideas about mitzvot. So we have to figure out what's the connection between tzitzit and bringing to mind mitzvot. Kashrut, the whole system of kashrut is a chok because there's no explanation. Why can't you eat certain animals and other animals you can eat? And so that needs decoding. Even Shabbat needs decoding. We would think that Shabbat is perfectly understandable. God's stopped creating on the seventh day, and so in the Seret HaDibrot it says we should not also create on the seventh day. Well, that doesn't explain anything. I mean, why? What's the symbol of not creating on the seventh day? What's it supposed to to represent. So we have, and the Shabbat is called an ot. We say that ot hi la'olam. Shabbat is an everlasting symbol. So we have to decode the symbol. The para aduma, the red heifer, is all symbolic. And the whole system of Tuma and Tara, which the Torah spends many, many chapters on, and many subjects have to do with spiritual purity, which is Tahara, and spiritual impurity, which is Tuma. All of that is all symbolic ritual. So these, according to Hirsch, need symbolic interpretation in order to discover the underlying meaning and purpose. And how do you do that? You do that by a close reading and decoding of the text in context. In other words, you look at the words, you look at the nuance, you look at the symbolic language, but you also look at the context of the rest of the Torah in order to understand how it fits in with everything else. And it's not a method that is midrashic. Midrashic is an entirely different method. It's the method that you'll hear in rabbi sermons, typically a drasha. It's called drasha because it's midrash, which has a different purpose. It wants to teach you some kind of a value, a Jewish value, and it uses a pasuk as the jumping off point for telling you what the rabbi wants to teach you, which is fine, and that's, I mean, it's a way of teaching, but that's not the same. That's not a close reading to understand what the text is conveying. In other words, what's the original meaning? What's the original teaching of the text itself? That's not midrashing. That's called pshat, and that's Hirsch's approach, and others, Rashbam and Sforno. There are other commentators who also, Ramban often, are also pashtanim, people who look at the text and try to discover what's being communicated by the text, the language of the text itself. But in order to do that, your ideas have to be supported by the perspective of the audience. In other words, the Torah was given, says Hirsch in a number of places, to a particular audience, and what you interpret the text as teaching has to be understood to the particular audience. If it's way above the audience, now remember these are uneducated slaves, then most likely you're not correct in your inference. And that's why you have an oral tradition, you have Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that serves a different purpose of taking the principles, the concepts, and applying them for each generation, which is going to change. And therefore you have a organic development of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was finally sort of systematized in the system of Mishnah and then the Talmud after that. But all of that is a whole different discussion. This is all just to say that we're going to approach this last ritual, this ritual of the calf, the Egla Arufah, in order to sort of decode its message and understand what is it that why is it so important that the Torah makes a particular ritual and puts it into a ritualistic form which will preserve the ideas that it's supposed to represent. So that's how we're going to study it. So, and I said that there's context. You always have to study the text in context. So before we get to the text of the Egla Arufah, the text in our Parsha at the end of Shoftim, we're going to take a look at another context, which is going to allow us to understand and decode the context of the ritual of the Egla Arufah. And this is it's a context of a different mitzvah, of a different ritual, and that's the Ir Miklat. In the end of Matot and Maseh, the end of Maseh, we have the laws of a city of refuge. What happens if somebody takes the life of another human being who's innocent of any crime. In other words, you've taken the life of a human being, and you've done it accidentally or carelessly. In other words, you didn't mean to, you didn't commit murder, you didn't want to kill somebody, but you were not careful enough, and somehow you contributed to the person's death, even though it was unintentional. And that's what an ir miklat is. But what's important for us, without going through all those laws, is that at the end of that paragraph, it tells you from a spiritual point of view, from the Torah's ethics point of view, why this is so important, and why the person who has even innocently taken the life of somebody else has to go to a city of refuge. Because it says, Lo tachanifu et haaretz. It's a very interesting word. Lo tachanifu. Chanifa is to be hypocritical, which is a strange word. Don't make the land hypocritical, asher atem ba, that you're going to enter, meaning Eretz Israel. When you come into Eretz Israel, don't make the land hypocritical, ki hadam hu yachanif et haaretz, because spilling innocent blood on on the earth, on the ground of Eretz Israel, is considered making the land hypocritical. We'll talk about that. How is that so? Ula'aretz lo yichupar ledam asher shupach ba, and the land cannot atone for this innocent blood that was shed on it, ki im bedam shovcho, only in the blood of the one who shed it. In other words, if somebody takes the life of a human being, that will make the land tameh, spiritually impure, and it can only be redeemed or atoned for by the life of the one who shed the blood. V'lo tetameh et haaretz asher ata yoshvim ba, and you are not to make the land polluted, tameh, spiritually impure, on the land that you're going to inherit. Asher ani shochen betocha, because I, God, dwell in that land. God's presence is in the holy land of Eretz Yisrael, and if God's presence is there, then the land can't be impure. It can't be tameh. Okay. So, what is this talking about? In Parshas Maseh, you discussed it when discussing the laws of this manslayer, the one who is took the life of another, but unintentionally. The Torah notes that the shedding of innocent blood defiles the land. It creates tumah. It makes it spiritually impure. But why? Why is it called, it makes the land hypocritical? Because the land of Eretz Yisrael was designed to be a blessing. It was designed to support life. It was designed to produce food for human beings and for your cattle and for everything. In other words, it was designed to create life, not absorb spilled blood, which is the death of human beings. So you're forcing the land to be hypocritical by having to absorb the life of spilled blood of an innocent human being. We had that. I think, with the Cain and Abel story, and the term used is you force the earth to open its mouth in order to absorb the blood. In other words, you're forcing the earth to absorb innocent blood. It shouldn't. It doesn't want to, but you're forcing it to do that. It's an image, metaphorical image of making the earth do something which it's not designed, which God did not design it to do. God designed the earth to produce life and support human life, and not to have to absorb the blood of someone who was killed. The polluted land, therefore, makes the land hypocritical and needs expiation to restore its innate spiritual purity, to make it tahor again, in order for God's pleasant presence to be there, by the death of the Kohen Gadol. And when it's talking about the Ir Miklat, the only thing that will make the land tahor again, that will atone for the death of the innocent victim, is the death of the Kohen Gadol, because you can't kill the manslayer because he's not guilty of murder. So you can't, his blood cannot redeem the land, but the death of somebody has to redeem the land, and the Kohen Gadol takes the responsibility of Am Yisrael, and his death will expiate, will atone for the innocent blood that was spilled on Eretz Yisrael and restore the Tahara. So it's very, very sort of mystical and metaphysical and spiritual, but that's the Torah's language is giving. In other words, this is not from the Zohar. It's not from Jewish mysticism. This is the Torah's own concepts of what Tuma and Tara are spiritual purity, spiritual impurity, how what the people do affects the spiritual purity of the land, the holy land that God gave the Bnei Israel, and the land in which God dwells. So this is part of the system. Okay, now this is the context. In other words, what this is telling us is whenever there is a death of a human being, either by murder, like violence, or even if it's unintentional, the land becomes impure. The land becomes tameh, and there has to be some type of atonement, some type of kapara that can get rid of the pollution of the land. So to keep that in mind, and let's go back to our story. Um, so now, in the ritual of the Egla Arufa, so the case that we're presented in this parsha is of an intentional murder. Now, here is a case, this is not an unintentional murder. This is somebody, in other words, an unintentional taking of a human life, which is what the shogeg was in the Ir Miklat. Ir Miklat is about people who unintentionally have taken a life, and they can run to an Ir Miklat. Okay, here it's not the case. The case is that a person was murdered. Okay, and remember what it said, that the only atonement for making the earth spiritually impure, tuma, by forcing it to absorb the blood of a victim, is the life of the murderer. Okay, but here, what do you do in our case? In our case, the perpetrator of the slaying is not known. You don't know who murdered this person. All you have is the corpse. You only have the victim. So how can you affect expiation of the land? The land is now tameh because there is a human life has been shed on the land by somebody, and you don't know who the somebody is. So the murderer's life cannot be used to expiate the tuma. Okay, everybody following me up to now?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, we're okay. How is the spiritual purity of the Holy Land to become restored? And so this is what the Egla Arufa is about. The Egla Arufa is designed to, through a ritual, to restore the Tahara, the spiritual purity, to the land which has become impure and where you can't find the murderer in order to effect atonement. How are you going to effect atonement for the land? And that's what this Egla Arufa is about. So here, this is the text. I'll just briefly go through it. You find a corpse in the ground. In other words, in some field someplace. Asher Hashem Elokecha nosei lecha l'rishta. What, not talking about chutz la'aretz. You're talking about only on the land of Eretz Yisrael. You find a corpse someplace, no fail basadeh, in some field someplace. Lo nada mi hikahu, and you don't know who killed that person. V'yatzu zikanecha v'shoftecha. So now the elders of the city and the judges of the city have to go out and measure the distance between the corpse and the cities surrounding that field, that whole area that doesn't belong to anybody. Asher sevivot halal, that's around the corpse. V'haya hakrova el halal, and the city that's closest, or the Gemara explains the city that's the largest to that location. Eglat bakar, the elders of the city have to take a calf, asher lo ubadba, that has never been yoked, it's never been used for anything, asher lo mashcha bo'al, and has not done any work and is young, so that it's not fertile, has not had any calves itself. And the elders should take this calf, el nachal eitan, to a riverbed, asher lo ye'eved bo, that was not cultivated, velo yizarea, and its banks were not plowed, nothing was sown there. V'arfu sham et ha'egla banachal, and you break the neck of the egla in that location. Now, it doesn't say you shecht it. You don't shecht it because this has nothing to do with a korban. This is not a sacrifice, not a korban, which is why there's no Kohanim who's doing this at this. The Kohanim are going to come in the next sentence after this is done. So you have to kill this egla either by hitting it over the head or the neck, the back of the neck, with some kind of a blunt instrument, or the Torah Shabbal Peh said you use a sword, you actually behead it, but it doesn't say that. Our food, it says to break the neck. But in any case, the point is, this is not a sacrifice. This is not a korban. It has nothing to do with that. This is a ritual that has symbolic meaning. In the next stage, V'nigshu HaKohanim B'nei Levi, now the Kohanim join the group, Kivam B'char Hashem Elokecha L'sharto, because the Levim are involved in this whole ritual. We'll see why shortly. Ulevarech B'Shem Hashem V'al Pihem Yeh Kol Riv V'chol Noga, and they are the judges. The Kohanim and the Levim are the judges. And they now join the Zikanim, the elders, the administrators of the city, and they join in this ritual. Next pasuk, v'chol ziknei ha'ir ahi akrovim el hachal. So all of the elders of the city, which is the closest or the largest, yirchatzu et yedehem al ha'egla arufa banachal, should ritually wash their hands like we do for Netilat Yadayim. They ritually wash their hands, and they say, V'amru Yadenu, our hands, lo shafchu et hadam hazeh, our hands did not shed this blood. In other words, we're cleansing our hands like the Kohanim do before they do Birkat Kohanim. They go and wash their hands. It's an act of tahara. You're making your hands tahor. So that's what they said. We made our hands tahor because we want to show that we are not tameh. We did not shed this blood. Ve'einenu lo ra'u, and we didn't see who the murderer is. Kaper la'amcha Yisrael, please atone for your people Israel. Asher batita Hashem, that you redeem God. V'al titein dam naki b'kerev amcha Yisrael, and don't allow innocent blood to be spilled on this holy land. V'nekaper lahem adam, and atone for this spilled blood. V'ata, and you, God, please, tiva'er hadam hanaki mikirbecha, remove this innocent blood that's causing the tuma, kitase hayashar b'einei Hashem, and do because we're doing what's right in God's eyes. In other words, we're doing this ceremony in order to atone for the spilled blood of a victim, of a human being, which was taken violently in this case, and that we can't use the murderer to atone for the spilled blood because we can't find him. So this ritual should atone for this act of murder, and therefore allow the land to become tahor again. Okay, so now we have to figure out what's the connection between this ritual and making atonement for the land. So let's summarize this picture. A corpse, which is clearly the victim of a violent murder, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a corpse that died naturally. Okay, there you don't do this ritual. If somebody is found dead and there's no indications of violence on his body, so he may have died of a heart attack or something, and it's nobody's fault. And so that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about a victim of a violent murder, and he's found lying in the open field. The murderer, who makes no attempt to hide the body, by the way. In other words, this is not a body that was buried or hidden. It was somebody murdered another person and walked away. So we don't know who it is. In such a case, members of the court are called to measure the distances from the location of the crime to the nearest city or the biggest city in all directions. Then the elders from the closest city or the largest city take a heifer, which is a female calf under 2 years. I mean, it's not a fertile calf yet, which has never worked or drawn a yoke, down to a hard rocky valley. And this barren place, this is the dry riverbed, this barren place did not support growth and would henceforth be prohibited from cultivation. In other words, because it's a riverbed, so every once in a while you'll get, if there's enough water, enough rain, you'll get water that's going through this riverbed, and if it overflows the banks, then you can seed on the banks of the river and maybe grow some things because it's watered. Okay, but here you're not allowed to use the river or the cultivation of the river banks when it overflows. It has to be left alone and never can be touched. There the elders would kill this heifer by breaking its neck, and at that point the Kohanim, Levim, the judges come, the priests come after this, because this ceremony has nothing to do with korbanot. Then the elders wash their hands and declare, our hands have not shed this blood, nor have our eyes seen it. And finally, the priests pray for the atonement because of the innocent blood violently shed on the holy soil of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that's a summary of what that paragraph says. So now the question is, what's the symbolic teachings that are inherent in this whole system? What is the ritual? Why is a ritual performed with a young heifer, which has never worked and has never produced any calves? Why does the ritual take place at a barren location? Why do elders declare their innocence to a crime which really they're not guilty? In other words, nobody has accused the elders of shedding the blood of this victim. No, none of the elders killed them. So why did they declare their innocence of something which is so obvious? And fourth, why are there three groups of people who administer the ceremony? It's judges, it's Kohanim, and it's elders. Okay, so we have to answer, Hirsch has to answer all these questions in order to decode the symbolism of what is this ritual supposed to convey. So before we get to Hirsch and the Ramban, who's going to say a similar thing, look at the Rambam. The Rambam, you know, wrote his halachic works, which are all halachic, the Yad Chazakah, but he also wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. And it's a philosophical work, and within this philosophical work is trying to explain the meaning of mitzvot to people who are intrigued by the mitzvot that are in the Torah, but they don't have any real education and background to understand why. So the Rambam gives reasons that people can understand. He does the same thing with kashrut. If you remember the Rambam's explanation of kashrut in the Moreh Nevuchim, is that it's unhealthy. Things that are tameh, things that you can't eat that are not kosher, are unhealthy food, and Jews are required to eat only healthy food. And when we talked about it then, we were talking about kashrut. We mentioned that, like other commentators say post Rambam, that this is a ridiculous explanation because non-Jews eat non-kosher food and they're no less healthy, probably more healthy than the Jews. So that whole medical thing didn't hold. But he's going to do the same thing here. He is going to give a sort of a social explanation of it, which is social explanations are not explanations of chukim. Um, but Rambam is going to try to give some meaning to this. So he says the purpose of this ritual was to identify the murderer. The whole thing is to identify who the murderer is. The elaborate ceremony with the court, the elders, and the priest served to publicize the crime. In other words, it was a big event. It was passed on through word of mouth through all these cities that there was a corpse found that was murdered, and so people should talk. That's what people do. And people could then say, oh, I know this guy and I know somebody who really hated him, and most likely I can identify who the murderer is. And that's what you wanted to do by making this big ceremony. So through all these,
Dave?
yeah,
Yeah, that feels dangerous because people talk, but people could make a mistake. And number
that's
two, that still doesn't answer or satisfy why particularly this ritual could be another ritual with, right?
exactly. Exactly. That's what the next commentators are going to say. They don't agree with the Rambam. I'm just telling you what the Rambam says, and they don't agree for exactly the reason that you just gave. But the reason of publicizing it is not that the people um, serve as a judge to condemn the murder. It means that they are witnesses or they come before the court and they say, well, look into this guy because we know that this guy had a grudge against the victim and maybe interview him or interrogate him, and maybe you can find the murderer. So that's what they wanted to do. They wanted the people to talk among themselves and maybe help the court to solve the problem, to see if they can find the murderer. So through all this publicity, says the Rambam, the murderer could be located. Remember, all news is spread by word of mouth. Moreover, he adds, the law forbids cultivation of the land on which the ritual takes place, and therefore provides a special incentive for the guy who happens to own the the fields in which the body was found, because he doesn't want to take away land which could be irrigated. So, in other words, he has a special motive more than everybody else to try to find the criminal so that they don't have to do this ritual. It could be canceled and his land would not have to lie fallow forever. Okay, so I mean, it's a creative explanation, but it's not really acceptable by people who want to understand what this ritual is about.
So one assumes that after the ritual, the inquiries, if you could put it that way, continued. They didn't just say, right, that's the end of the story. They continued looking for the person because my understanding always was that after the Eglah Rufa, that's it. That's the end of the story. They don't. But from what you're saying now, the inquiries probably
All of this,
continued, right?
right? In other words, no, I think it's beforehand. In other words, the whole purpose is to prevent the Eglah Rufa ceremony. And how do you prevent it?
Oh,
By finding the murderer. And how do you
oh,
find the murderer? By telling everybody what's going on and having them talk, and hopefully finding the murderer before you have to do the Eglah Rufa. Okay, so
oh.
this is the attempt to do it before, because once the Eglah Rufa is done, then first of all, the guy who owns the property can never use the property, and number two, they stop looking, and you don't want to, you want to find.
So that was my
Right. They stop looking after nobody takes the
assume that
responsibility.
after the Eglah Rufa, that's the end of the story.
That's
Yeah,
the end of it.
yeah.
So all of this, the Rambam says, should be before the Eglah Rufa, and to cancel it. The Ramban and other commentators,
Just a
including,
quick question.
yes,
All this gossip is going to get you to the right answer?
no, it's like, how does detectives do an investigation? They go
No,
around,
I understand, but we understood, I think, before this, that to be guilty of a murder, there have to be witnesses.
right, right.
All this gossip in a big telephone game circle is going to get you to that end?
No, it's not going to get you to the court's handling of the case. That's up to the court, right? So if the court has finds witnesses, let's say through all the talk, they identify somebody who should be looked at. And then the court and the Shotrim come and they start interviewing people. Did you see anything? Where were you? Did you see this guy hit? Are there witnesses to the murder? Then the court handles the case. They identify a suspect and he's brought to the court, and the court handles the case and sees what they can do. Okay, that's the purpose of doing all of this. Okay, but in other words, it's to the first strategy is to find the murderer, and only when you can't find the murderer, then you have to do this second thing, which is the Eglah Rufa, which means you can't find the murderer, but you have to find some way of atoning for the spiritual impurity that's caused by a murder victim on the soil of Eretz.
Steve,
Yeah.
where would they bury the body afterwards?
Why would they?
Where would they? Where did they bury the body?
They didn't bury it. That's the point. It wasn't buried. It was left in the open. The murderer murdered the person, didn't even care about hiding his crime. He
Yeah, but
did it.
after the whole ceremony, surely they did something with the body, the elders
Yes,
and
no,
the.
no. Of course, after the ceremony, the body is buried. It's a mitzvah. It's a requirement. And the Torah says specifically, if you find the body in a field, you are required immediately to bury it. Even the Kohen Gadol has to make himself tameh to bury a body that's found in the field. It's not buried. So it's a special mitzvah to bury it, and they will definitely bury the body immediately. Okay, so that's a separate thing. But it doesn't have to do with the ceremony. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, so the Ramban notes that the killing a calf is not a humane act. He says, why, you can't ignore the ceremony of taking the life of killing a calf, it's just like you would have to understand how come you can shecht an animal for a korban, because a korban serves a higher purpose. The korban serves the purpose of bringing a korban and to eat, use it for food. So that's allows human beings to kill an animal. So how could you? There has to be a rationale for killing a calf, because it's not a humane act unless there's serving a higher purpose, like for food, for korbanot. So the ritual must have a much deeper meaning. So the Ramban and others say we have to analyze the symbolism of this because it's got to teach us something. So if you take a look at their proclamation, the proclamation of the judge, of the Zikanim, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. In other words, we didn't witness what happened, except this atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, God, and do not hold your people guilty of the blood of an innocent person. Okay, so this is what they ask for atonement for this. So this is the question: who is the calf representing? In other words, what is the calf? What's the calf the symbol of? So here is a machloket between the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Bavli rabbis see the elders referring to the victim when they say, we have not allowed him to go into the fields unescorted. In other words, what's their guilt that they're saying we're not guilty of? We're not guilty of knowing there's there are bad people in the fields, and we wouldn't let anybody in our city go out late at night alone, because it's our responsibility to tell people not to travel in the middle of the night where it's very dangerous. That's our responsibility.
Is that why we walk guest home or distance out of the house?
That's a different one. That's Abraham's. We're imitating Abraham, who always walked his guests when he's finished. No, but here we're talking about somebody who's outside the city limits. In other words, if somebody is traveling, people travel between cities, but it was the responsibility of a city to make it known to anybody that's traveling through its city, do not go out at night by yourself. It's dangerous. So the elders are saying, we in our city, our government has taken the responsibility to tell people who are passing through our city, not to go out at night alone because it's dangerous. So they're saying we're not guilty of allowing people to go out at night. We have like warning signs. We make it known that if you're in our city and you want to leave, you should wait till daybreak, till it's light, or go with a group of people. Don't go out alone. That's what the Babylonian, the Chachamim of Bavel see, that these elders are saying we're not guilty of allowing people in our city or are passing through our city to go out into the fields unescorted or dangerously. The people in Yerushalmi say that it refers to the murderer. And what they're saying we're not guilty of is we're not guilty of allowing people who are known criminals to pass through our city. In other words, we don't allow criminals in our city. And that's our responsibility as the government of the city. So you can either attribute their statement of we're not guilty to the referring to the victim or referring to the murderer. Either one, you can understand that the people of the city are saying we're not guilty of either one of those things.
Steve,
Her,
I know this is a very silly question.
Mhm.
How do they not know that the person who was murdered or was killed didn't go out to kill somebody else and the other person killed him? So in self-defense.
So they're not saying that they have identified the potential murderer and they didn't stop him. They're not saying that because they can't. What they can say is, we know, cities, people know who are visitors, who are travelers, who don't live there. People know stuff. So if we have a traveler that's going through our city, so we tell somebody in the city, at the tavern, at the inn, wherever the person sleeps at night, tells, we don't advise you to go out at night because it's dangerous. That would be the responsibility of the people of the city. And they're saying, we tell people who are passing through not to go out. Or if somebody comes in the city and the people of the city recognize by reputation, or they're told that these are gang leaders, or these are robbers, or these are thieves, or these are murderers, then we don't allow them to stay in our city. We throw them out of our city. So we're not guilty of harboring potential criminals. Number one, that's one thing that we won't be guilty of. And number two, we're also not guilty of allowing people to put themselves in harm's way. So Hirsch says it could be either one, and either one teaches you something. You can learn from either of these. Blatant murder carried out with no remorse or attempt to hide the crime. Remember, the person doesn't bury the body, is a mockery of civil law and justice. In other words, when a blatant murderer kills somebody and doesn't care and just kills somebody and walks away, it's a mockery of law and order. Such an act reflects negatively on community leaders and judges. It means that they're not doing their responsibility. Okay? And this is, by the way, if you want to put it in modern terms, this is what in our times the Arab communities, which have a lot of murder going on, are complaining that it's the government responsibility to protect the citizens of the city. And the government says, you're right, but it's also your responsibility as the mayor of the Arab city that you're responsible not to harbor gangs that kill each other. So, there's responsibility of people who are leaders of a city to take responsibility for those people who are in the city. Okay? Thus, the elders had to openly declare that they were not negligent in their public responsibility as leaders of a moral and just community to address the gravity of murder to their citizens. In other words, the people, the Zikanim, are the officials, city officials. Zikanim have to say, we have law and order in our city, and we do not tolerate people who make a mockery of the law and order, and we have not been negligent in our public responsibilities of maintaining law and order in our city. The ritual symbol can also be taken in two ways, says Hirsch. First of all, a young female heifer, which has never worked, is symbolic of a non-productive life. In other words, she's too young to produce offspring, and she has made no contribution to society. So you take something that symbolizes a life which has not had an opportunity to be productive. And like the victim, if the heifer is to be the metaphor of the victim, her life meets a violent early demise on the ground, which is similarly non-productive. In other words, the non-productive animal is gives up its life on ground which is similarly non-productive. So the focus here is non-productivity. And what is it teaching you is that a human life has the human right to live and to be productive. And now the murderer has taken away the right of this human being to be productive in their life. They are no longer alive. That's the crime. The Midrash explains it. And they said, an animal that has not yet become fruitful is killed at a place that is not to become fruitful, and so atones for one who has been denied the possibility of becoming fruitful. It's a very concise way of telling you what the symbolism is. The Midrash sees the ritual as referring to the victim, which has been denied forever the possibility of becoming a productive human being. And so here is truth number one, or lesson number one of the Torah's teaching by this ritual, that if somebody takes the life of a human being, even if it's not a young human being, the life of a human being who has not had the chance to fulfill its own fruitful, productive life, whether by having children of the next generation, whether it's whatever their career is, by contributing to society in some way. But by taking a human life, you have taken away the right of the person to be productive, no matter how old they are. And that is a fundamental violation of human rights that the Torah is trying to teach you. Or if the discussion of the Babylonian people are right, and this is the murderer, it's not the victim, all murderers are compared to the calf. Just as it is killed by a sword to the neck, by such a method are murderers to be executed. In other words, the other way of looking at it is that what you're supposed to learn is what happens to a murderer, even though the murderer is not found yet. But murderers are compared to this calf, which means its life is ended. It does not deserve to be productive, just as it took away the ability of their victim to ever be productive. So does justice require that they are not allowed to be productive. Now, if the calf represents the murderer and not the victim, the view is expressed that the person who deprived his fellow human being of his right to life has no future for himself. Now, in this case, even if he's not brought to a human court because he's unknown, so if he's brought to a human court and if he is convicted of taking a life, then the Torah says he forfeits his life because he's taken another life. God's justice demands that the murderer's life become as fruitless, and as useless as the non-productive heifer. In other words, if we don't know who the murderer is, we can't bring him to justice in court. We leave it to God's justice, that this murderer will not live a life of meaningfulness, will not contribute anything, is going to be sort of depressed and unhappy and non-productive for the rest of his life by God's intervention. The murderer is cursed by being destined to a future life. But what's the value to be learned? In other words, what's the Torah's teaching that it wants to teach us by this symbolic ritual? Is that the Torah's position on capital life, a life for a life, nefesh tachat nefesh, is that you can't get away from the fact, the Torah says explicitly, that anybody who takes a human life intentionally, a murderer, is from a point of justice point of view, has to forfeit his or her own life. And that's why many people say in our contemporary times that terrorists who are clearly by witnesses have killed victims should get capital punishment, a life for a life, just as they took away the possibility of these people who they killed by their terrorist action of being productive human beings for the rest of for their lifetime, they've taken away that. You have to take away their right to life as well. That's a Torah rationale for a life for a life. So one can't argue from a Torah's perspective that there shouldn't be a death penalty for terrorists, for example, who are very clearly guilty of taking innocent lives. So the whole message, taking the rich symbolism of the entire ritual, we can discern two themes. The first theme concerns the grave responsibility of the Jewish community that the Jewish community bears for the safety and the well-being of its citizens, both for the well-being of and safety of its citizens and for not harboring people who can harm its citizens. A crime against an individual is actually a crime against the community, which is represented by the elders. It's a crime against society, which is represented by the court, and it's a crime against God, who's represented by the priests. That's why those three groups are present for this ritual. It's pointing out that murder is a crime against all three groups: the community, society at large, and against God. Secondly, the ritual demonstrates the unique, irreplaceable value of human life. It's another fundamental teaching of the Torah, that all people, everybody is equal, all human lives are equal. Denying a fellow human being the chance to live and make his unique contribution to the world, which is what the calf represents when it's representing the victim, is unacceptable to the Torah. And this is in contrast to almost all the other codes of the ancient Near East, where all human beings were not equal. Slaves had one law and they were treated as property. You could kill slaves, you can maim them, you can do whatever you want to slaves. There was different laws for aristocrats versus common citizens. Here the Torah says when it comes to life, all life is equal, and someone who takes the life of another human being and takes away their right to their life has forfeited the right to his own life. The murderer results in a fruitless, meaningless future for the criminal. If the court can't find him and can't kill him, then we have to believe that God is going to effect justice and not allow a murderer to get away with murder. Such is the value of a single, irreplaceable human life. Okay, that's our teaching for Shoftim for today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
All right.
Shavua Tov,
Shavua
everybody.
Tov.
Shakach, shakach.
Okay, Shavua Tov to
Thank
everybody.
you, Shavua Tov, Besorot
Hopefully-
Tovot, and
Hopefully,
Refuah Shalema to Tzvi.
so Tzvi, we're all
Yeah.
praying for Tzvi's recovery.
Thank you.
Let us know.
Okay, bye.